Wonderful.
Here. She was a senior editor at the Jerusalem Post for many, many years, endeared herself to the Anglo-American community, now blogs for Hayom.
Israel Hayom.
The initial project of writing the book was supported by David Azrieli. I knew David in the old country when he donated one of the schools at Yeshiva University, where I was quite active. Wonderful guy. He helped to make sure that this book comes to realization. David Horowitz, is there anybody here who doesn't know David Horowitz? David, I think some people came because they wanted to see if you were going to have a new corduroy jacket. You never missed so far. He's been intimately involved with the Great Synagogue. He conducts the conversation annually with the mayor running the most difficult city in the world. That will be in January. He has spoken. He moderates the program whenever there's an election of newcomers. The book is controversial in the sense that it deals with a very sensitive political subject in the United States and its effect on Israel. We never have advocated a particular party or person in a political process. What we do encourage you to do is to get to know the facts, opposing opinions, and come to your own conclusion. When you come to your own conclusion and you want to vote, you have to fill out a form, absentee voting form. There's a desk open over there. It takes just a couple of minutes to fill out the form. It will allow you, based on your own final determined feelings, who you should vote for. We encourage you, do vote. Tonight we'll be in a conversation mode, as we've done in previous programs. Following that, there'll be a Q&A. Ruthi and David, it's yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me okay at the back? Yes, if it dies, you will sort of gesture frantically, please. Good evening. Thank you, Asher, for the lovely introduction as ever. Thank you for coming. It's very nice for me to be sitting here with Ruthi again. We used to work together at the Jerusalem Post. I guess in the interest of full disclosure, I should acknowledge I've known David Azrieli for some time. It's kind of a long story. It involves his son-in-law, who's probably the leading exponent of karate in Israel, a guy called Danny Hakim, and my son is in a karate program with him. Anyway, to cut a long story short, David Azrieli was very interested in having a book written on sort of the Carter presidency and some lessons that it might offer for the Obama presidency and so on. And I just didn't have the time to do it, and I suggested that Ruthi might be a terrific person to do it, and that the result is the book that we're going to be talking about tonight. That's by no means to say that I would necessarily have written the same book, but that's one of the genesis of this book, and we'll talk a little bit about the book, and we'll do some Q&A from the audience later on and so on. I'm imagining most people have not had the opportunity to read the book. So we'll talk about some of the content, which I think is very interesting. One of the things that struck me right away, and we're talking, the Carter presidency, we're talking about the end of the 70s here, that Israel escaped the kind of hostage crisis that is the centerpiece of this book, the 444 days, if I'm correct, that Americans were held hostage by the new Khomeini revolutionary leadership in Iran by the skin of our teeth, right? People in February 1979, you right there. The Israelis basically dashed out the back door, the skeleton staff of the Israeli embassy in Tehran. Remember, we had very good relations with the Shah's Iran. The Islamists take over, and that skeleton team, in the way you put it, runs out the back door as the potential hostage takers are coming in the front. I just thought, tell us a little bit more about that, and then we'll come on to the American and
even more interesting and typical of American administrations throughout, not only Democrats or Republicans, but in this case it was the Jimmy Carter administration. When the Israelis were running at the back door, really, literally, absconding, the Americans said to them, no, come stay with us, come stay at our embassies, we'll hide you. And they said, you think that you're going to be safe? What, they'll attack our embassy? And in fact, that's exactly what happened a few days later. Not only that, but not only was the American embassy taken over a few days later, among the hostage takers was a 23-year-old student, so-called, named Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Yes, I would think that most people know that, but it turns out that not everybody does know that. He was one, in fact, there's a famous photograph of him carrying out American hostages, diplomats, blindfolded and tied with their hands behind their back. And Jimmy Carter wrote in his diary on November 4th, 1979, if the host government does not help you when your embassy is taken hostage, there is nothing you can do. So this really struck me very strongly, as you can imagine. But what is most interesting about this book, David mentions, it really is, because it's nice coming full circle, it really is true, that David was asked to write this book and then said, well, he didn't have time, or he didn't want to, or he couldn't, and he suggested that I do it. And I said, great. I had left the Jerusalem Post. I said, terrific, let me see. I said, terrific, and then panicked. How am I going to write this book? But I said, all right, I'll research it. And the idea of the book was supposed to be how Jimmy Carter influenced events that are happening to this day, and that now Iran is about to have a nuclear weapon. But 4 months into my research and my interviews, I interviewed a lot of people. People from then, I interviewed former hostages, I interviewed Henry Kissinger, many people. I interviewed people who had been at the Israeli embassy, who had absconded. And 4 months into it, the so-called Arab Spring erupted. And what was so amazing that I said, oy vey, there goes my book. Now what? Who cares about Jimmy Carter and Iran? There's this whole thing going on here. And as I began to watch it in Tunisia, and then mainly Egypt. Egypt is really the best example because it's such a crucial country and interesting you can follow it to see how similar the American administration is behaving in relation to what is going on. Similar in its adherence to negotiations above all, no matter what. And also what is interesting is that this came on the heels of the counter-revolution in Iran in June 2009, where people were taking the streets to protest the Ahmadinejad and Mullah-led government to get out from under the thumb of radical Islam. And the American administration abandoned them, said, you know, hey, you're having a democratic election. In fact, Hillary Clinton called it there's a robust debate and election going on in Iran. And we don't want to interfere in their robust democratic system. And while that robust democratic system was going on, what happened was Ahmadinejad stole the election from Mustafi, and that was the end of that. However, when similar things began to happen in Tunisia and in Egypt, where, on the contrary, the leaders of those countries, though autocratic and you wouldn't call them great guys or anything, okay? They weren't Democrats by any means, but they were allies, longtime allies of the United States. Mm-hmm. And the United States abandoned them. So what you have here is a situation where the United States was treating the people trying to get out from under a radical Islamic regime, treating them hostilely and embracing the Islamists who were trying to create Islamist regimes all over the rest of the Middle East.
Okay, so we moved a little from my original question there, but
I know, but you know.
That's okay. This isn't going to be one of these me shooting you questions every 30 seconds and holding you to a brief answer. So don't worry.
Okay.
But I'm striking now. Let's come sort of to the big picture, and without getting into this or that administration, what seems common to that whole process that you already began to describe is a combination of real ignorance about this region. By the way, not only of American leaderships, but it seems to me a bit of Israeli leaderships as well, which is kind of peripheral to the book, but I think it's interesting. You know, we talk about the embassy almost being taken over, the Israeli embassy in Iran, while, you know, last September, the Israeli embassy in Egypt, people getting out by the skin of their teeth because they didn't really quite believe what was unfolding before their eyes and so on. But the sort of big picture, it seems to me, is this, and I think this is common to certainly throughout your book, the failure to really understand this region, the absence of tools, not enough people speaking Arabic, not enough people on the ground, and then added to that an almost willful refusal to honestly interpret what's unfolding before your eyes. You know, what you talk about, you know, the reluctance in the United States at the time of the '79 revolution to acknowledge who Khomeini was, and that he'd actually written some of the radical things that he'd written. And you know, you have some very nice material there about Bernard Lewis, you know, trying to submit an op-ed to the New York Times warning about who this guy is, just on the basis of the things that he's written.
And the New York Times response, Bernard Lewis said, look, everyone keeps talking about this mysterious figure, the Ayatollah Khomeini, some cleric. You know, it's driving me crazy that they're calling him mysterious. I heard about the Khomeini, who was in exile. He had been exiled, and he was by the Shah, and he was living in Paris, among other places, and he said, what do I do? I'm an academic. I went to the library at Princeton, and I looked up, and it turns out he'd written things. They were in Persian and in Arabic. But Bernard Lewis, luckily, knows those languages. So he read the books, and then he said, oh my God, it says in here, you know, destroy the West and all that. And he said, this stuff is not this is not just some nice old guy with a beard. So he decided to write an op-ed for the New York Times. And he said, I would like to write this op-ed exposing who the Ayatollah Khomeini is. And the op-ed editor of the New York Times said, nah, nobody's going to be interested in the views of some old Persian guy. So when you call this willful, it was certainly willful then, but you know, one could argue that in those days, we hadn't had experience with that particular form of radicalism. We'd seen Nazism, we'd seen Stalinism, and so they didn't really, you could say it wasn't yet something, today we all are familiar with it, but in those days, no. However, the CIA had been completely demolished and decimated on purpose. Aside from everything else, the CIA had no operatives on the ground in Iran anymore, and the CIA didn't speak Farsi or Arabic. And furthermore, the director of the CIA that Carter appointed, Stansfeld Turner, said that is completely outdated. Technology makes espionage on the ground outdated. Does that sound familiar? How many times have we said warfare is now technological, it's outdated, we don't need tanks, we don't need information in that. And that's willful. No question about it.
Talk us through a little bit about the Centerpiece Sea. Take us back to '79 and how the embassy is taken, and you talk about how the people whose job it was to ensure that the embassy not to be taken failed, and why, and some of the mindset. Remind us of that period.
Okay, well, before I remind you about that, there is one also interesting thing. 6 months before the actual embassy takeover that lasted a year and a quarter, 6 months earlier, on Valentine's Day, the embassy had been taken over and a U.S. Marine had been killed. And that was during the interim government before the Ayatollah Khomeini was officially declared supreme leader. And when that happened, after a couple of days, the interim government between the Shah's regime and the Ayatollah Khomeini actually did step in and put a stop to it. So 6 months later, now the Ayatollah Khomeini is in power and the embassy is taken over. And by the way, the Americans knew that something big was going down because there were millions of Iranians about to demonstrate. That it was on a Sunday, actually. So they left us, they told everybody at the embassy that, to be on guard. They were used to hearing these incredible demonstrations out their windows, screaming, Allahu Akbar, kill America, kill the Jews, kill Israel, killed the great Satan, killed Jimmy Carter. This was what they heard all the time. So they were in some sense prepared, but they were not prepared for this major event. And what happened on that day was that the charge d'affaires of the embassy was like the ambassador. He was sort of an acting ambassador. He took a couple of people with him to the Iranian Foreign Ministry to try to say, look, you know, our embassy's in danger, to go to talk to them. And while he was at the Foreign Ministry, the embassy walls were scaled, and all these students began to go in and take over the embassy. And the charge d'affaires, his name is Bruce Langen, and he's still alive, and I interviewed him in his home in Virginia. He was famous because his wife was the person who put yellow ribbons around trees, and they sang, you know, tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree. That was his wife, Penny Langen, who started that campaign of the yellow ribbon. Bruce Langen, his view as a State Department guy was, you don't make waves. So when the embassy was taken over, he had the telephone. He was by telephone contact with the people at the embassy, and they said, we're holed up. A few of them were holed up in an office. They're on the telephone. Others were already blindfolded and taken captive, and it was happening, and people were hiding out. And Bruce Langen basically gave the command, surrender with your head held high. There are Marines there, they've got their guns, and their command is to surrender with your head held high.
Ruthi, no standing orders that when somebody breaches the walls of an embassy that they're all supposed to, I mean, was there,
There were
procedures, they were just ignored?
There were procedures, and the Marines had procedures, and they, in a way, they were shocked because as these students, so I say so-called students because many of them were actually students, although they hadn't really gone to class ever because they were really busy organizing to take over, to, you know, destroy America and things like that. So some of them, whatever classes they were in, they weren't in class with their professors. So they began, and there were masses of them. There were, so because the Marines had to wait for orders, some of them thought that what they should do is just start shooting, even if it meant getting injured. That's their job. They were guarding the embassy. But you see, this worldview that's very common to America and to Israel these days, which is very interesting because it's no accident that they call us they call Israel the small Satan and the United States the great Satan. We have a lot in common. Being satanic doesn't happen to be one of them, but being afraid to or being hesitant about using weapons and about shooting to kill we do have that in common. I know Israel has a different reputation, but it's actually the case. And one of the most striking things about this, as we spoke about this week, is that this embassy takeover was only 3 years after the Entebbe raid. If you think about that Israel was willing to, then, in those days, pull off the most risky, the most amazing rescue operation that had everything that could have gone wrong. It was so risky that had it gone wrong, we all would have been said, what, were they crazy trying to do it? And it succeeded. But even if it hadn't succeeded, there was an attempt, there was and the whole world looked on Israel as heroes. And then 3 years later, the superpower, America, has its embassy taken hostage. And the President of the United States and his says, negotiate with everyone who send it.
Okay, not a shot fired? Not a shot fired? Or was there
No, they didn't end up shooting at all. Their weapons, they hid their weapons, which were then found. They ended up all being tied up and all being brought to. There was no attempt.
And meanwhile, the senior diplomat is at the Iranian Foreign Ministry, where he actually, without realizing it for some time, has become a hostage.
Yes,
right?
he's a hostage and doesn't quite realize it yet because he's at the Foreign Ministry where they're treating him not so well. He and 2 other guys, they're put into a room with a telephone, and he's on the phone with Washington and on the phone with the embassy. But very soon after that, he realizes they're not allowed of their room. They were not allowed to shower. They had better food than the other hostages, but they were not allowed. They were held hostage as well, just in better conditions. Now, by the time another interesting thing that I was going to mention about the CIA. Stansfield Turner, the director of the CIA, whom I mentioned, said that technology means you don't really need operatives on the ground. Delta Force, the elite unit that was sent to rescue the hostages when eventually, months and months and months later, they finally were given a green light to do this rescue operation. Delta Force was training, and it was training all along. It was training to try to, it had a place called the Farm. They were training, and they created a small scale of the American embassy in Tehran. And they were training morning, noon, and night, and they had to perfect. This was really difficult. It was far away. They needed planes and helicopters and landing pads, similar to what's happening today. You know, Iran is not next door, and so it's very difficult, and there's difficult terrain and all of that stuff, and refueling planes and all that. So it wasn't just a question of rescuing them, it was a question of getting there, and then getting unseen to Tehran, and then getting to the embassy, and then getting the hostages out. So they're trying to do this whole complicated operation, and Stansfield Turner comes to visit them. And he says, how can I, as the director of the CIA, help you guys? And they said, oh, tell us where the hostages are being held inside the embassy. And he said, oh, that I can't tell you. And now I heard that from the person who became the subsequent head of Delta Force after Charlie Baker. Someone who was there, witnessed it, heard it. He said, oh, that I have no idea. But that was the CIA helping us.
You're scathing on the administration, on Carter, for allowing them to sit there for 434 days. A very, very long way away when they lacked basic intelligence information. What could, from the people you spoke to, what should have happened and how?
Well, for one thing, because they realized that now we're in trouble, we don't have operatives, there was a scramble to get some people in there. Delta Force did as well. There were certain people who knew Farsi who were going to go and arrange for trucks to help get the Delta Force team, to help them once they got to Tehran. There was a kind of, let's play catch up, which doesn't work very well anyway, but under the conditions of negotiations, it really didn't work. Because what was happening, I think more importantly even than military operations, has to do with a country's lip service and belief in itself. And the Carter administration, from day one, said, this country is a big bad cowboy, and we're going to show our enemies that we're good guys. We're not like our predecessors. Jimmy Carter was saying, we're not like Nixon and Ford. We are good guys, and we believe in making friends with our enemies. And he did it in every way possible, including writing a groveling letter on his own White House stationery to the Ayatollah Khomeini. Dear Ayatollah Khomeini, please don't hurt our hostages. There's room for, just talk to us. We have no beef with you. We have no gripes with you. Just let them, they're innocent people. Just let them out. Let us do. And sincerely, Jimmy Carter. Today, a very similar thing is going on. Negotiate with Iran. Today, the view has been that even right around the Iranian elections in 2009, the Obama administration's view was very similar. We are going to negotiate with whomever is in power, because that's it. Look, Israelis do that too. We should talk to Hamas because you don't negotiate with your friends, you negotiate with your enemies.
Well, you raised the Israel thing, you talk about 76 Entebbe, and I'm sure a lot of people in the audience are immediately conjuring up not terribly distant memories of the Shalit deal and, by the way, the internal conflict of Israel, which was, 80% of the Israeli public supported the deal and 60-something% thought it was a capitulation to terrorism, which is everything about the Israeli character. That's a very different Israel from 76. I want to come on to all of this, but I want to ask you fundamentally your thesis on Carter, and then we'll come on to Obama and so on. That it was more this unwillingness to embrace and be proud of America's greatness and capacity to encourage freedoms and democracies. It was that was the sort of central flaw, or a fundamental lack of comprehension about Islamic extremism, or a combination of them both.
Definitely both. But the first one is more important. You know what? If you have a lack of knowledge about your enemy, you could say that's a big flaw and it should be corrected. But if your fundamental view of your country as the president of that country is that you have a dim view of your own country, you have a dim view of American democracy, you have a dim view of that kind of liberalism, and yet you have a view that cultures, everyone practices his own culture in his own way, and his own democracy in his own way. Actually, Hillary Clinton did say that. Democracy is something that is practiced by each country in its own way. Now, I cannot stress how much a load of crap that is. You don't practice it. Yes, Britain practices parliamentary democracy in a different way from Israel. That's not the same as practicing, as looking at countries that have no clue about what democracy is. They have a clue. Actually, they study us a lot more than we study them. Let's put it that way. They do have a clue, and they don't like it. They don't believe in it. It's not that they think that democracy means that women are free and gays are free and whatever. The internet is free and people can choose and all that. They're against that. It isn't that they're practicing democracy in a different way. They're actively opposed to democracy. And somehow, as I say, Israel is often guilty of this same, everybody just wants to get along, and all we have to do is just sit around and we're going to explain to them that we really are good people. And we're going to give them what they want, and then they're going to like us. And instead they kill us again and again and again and again, and they say so, and they write it, they publish it. And
I think there are many counter-arguments that could be made from the Israeli perspective, and maybe we can come on to that again, but let me just try and follow through. So to complete the hostage saga, first of all, the botched rescue and crashing helicopters and sandstorms, the whole thing's a disaster, people die, it fails. Ultimately, after 444 days, they all come home.
Yes. Because, all right, here, I knew you were going to ask me that question, David.
Okay.
How did I know? There is an argument, and by the way, just for, to be honest here, Bruce Langdon, who was a hostage, says that thanks to Jimmy Carter, he's alive today because of the negotiations. Yes, they all got home except for a couple. One was ill, another one, whatever. They did get rescued. And by the way, the Canadian government rescued a few of them early on, and that is the release of those hostages, or the Canadians got them out of Iran. That actually helped America to know where the other hostages were located in the embassy. They gave very critical information. But I knew you were going to ask, okay, well, if they all got out alive, then shouldn't we then embrace negotiations? And my answer is...
That's a very good question that you've asked yourself. It's not the one I asked you, but well, that's okay.
I interpreted your question.
Yeah.
Okay,
Absolutely.
I know you pretty well already.
Take it away.
Okay.
Yes, okay.
People have asked that about Gilad Shalit, and my opinion is, no, it is not better. It's not better because it sets precedents that are atrocious. It's by the grace of God, Gilad Shalit is alive, and thank God, but at what expense? And the same thing with those hostages. And personally, you wanted to say, if the Entebbe raid had failed, as I said earlier, would we have said that we shouldn't have tried to do it? No. That determines what you think about your country and what you're willing to do to not to permit your enemies to walk all over you in the most dangerous way, especially enemies who have stated goals that they're going about achieving in front of your very eyes. And so, no, yes, they did come out alive, and at what expense? America was so weakened by that, and they should have come out alive fighting and being fought for. That's how they should have come home.
Hear, hear.
Let me ask you the same sort of question that I asked you about culture, about Obama, where I think I know the answer, but let's have you explain your sense. In the case of Obama, you would also argue that it's the, well, you can find the better word to say this, I think, but a failure to, or a disinclination to champion American greatness, rather than a misreading of Islamic extremism and the gravity of the threat. And let me just elaborate a little bit, because the Bush administration on Iran, for example, you could argue wasted 2 terms negotiating with Iran. You know, we all have, you know, well, we all.
I would, and I do argue that.
Many Israelis, you know, have a very good feeling about Bush, but, you know, 2 terms of Bush did not stop Iran. I think in Britain, and I've said this before for sure, in July 2005, when the public transport system was blown up by Islamic extremists, Britain has found it, and subsequent plots thwarted and so on, they find it very hard to internalize that, well, there are people who actually want to kill and be killed, not live and let live. That there is this profound disinclination, and I understand it because it's so counterintuitive to think, well, these people, they want to kill themselves and other people. They don't appreciate the divine gift of life. It's a hard ask, but that's not what you think is the motivation. And one more, you know, put your answer against this. So Obama goes off to Cairo and he makes his outreach to the Muslim world. You know, it could be argued that this was not an elaboration of American capitulation and weakness, but rather an effort to encourage a live and let live philosophy and marginalize the kill and be killed. So, with all of that context, your take on Obama and your sense of why there's a parallel or a continuation from Carter.
Okay, absolutely not. When Obama went to Cairo and gave his speech, he was not reaching out to moderate Muslims. He was reaching out to radical Muslims. He did so in word and deed, and if you reread what he said there, it was clear he was winking at the Muslim Brotherhood. He was not reaching out to those who opposed the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, it could be argued that it's just his lack of understanding of the Muslim world. But Obama himself has bragged about his understanding of the Muslim world, having grown up in Indonesia and hearing the prayers for the minarets and all that. Now, the point I'm making is that it is one thing to say, we are going to go after the radicals and we're going to embrace moderates of all kinds. That goes for North Korea and South Korea as well. That was not the message. That was not the message given, nor was it, certainly it was not the message received by the Islamic world. And when you say, you know, okay, it's hard to grasp that concept. Well, it depends who you are. If you are, you say, a Brit or a French or, you know, or whatever, you're an average anybody, it may be hard to grasp that concept. But if you are the leader of a country and you're in charge of that country's security, you better not have that naive attitude, because it is suicide, and we've seen it happen again and again. And you are right, I will get back to what you said about Bush. It is true that American administrations, they don't have to be democratic American administrations to be hesitant about using arms and about them. But there is one profound difference, and it is a difference in this attitude. If the attitude is, we are a great country and people should emulate us, we don't accept, it is not acceptable to us to mutilate young girls. It is not acceptable to us to have, to give money to countries that abuse women and minorities and Christians and whatever, Jews. It is not acceptable, and we will not consider that just your culture. If that's your culture, then it's a bad culture. Okay, it's not an equal culture. And just to give you a little anecdote that might also, you say that people have trouble grasping that there are people who will kill or kill themselves in order to kill, and we just want to live and we want our children to
I
live.
think for those of us who are raised appreciating
Yes.
the divine gift of life, it's very hard to wrap your head around the fact that
Yes.
Islamic extremist indoctrination tells you
Yes.
that the finest thing you can do for your God is kill and
Yes.
be killed.
But it's even harder to wrap your head around it if your leaders in all those countries are telling you that it's not true. And they're telling you it doesn't say that in the Quran, and they're telling you no, and everybody's everybody, and all. It's a little hard to grasp,
Well,
but
I
if
mean-
people are, if they're obfuscating that, of course you know, and if you're not paying enough attention, and you're just living your life, which is what most people want to do, that is the point about Israel and America. Everyone wants to be able to go to the movies without worrying about, that's a funny analogy since what happened in the movies in America recently. We want to go to a cafe in the movies, we want to live our lives without having to read the paper cover to cover every day and know whether we need to get our gas mask today or tomorrow. In order to do that, we need a society that both is free in that way and also has the people in charge of fighting for it, doing their job. And that is what is lacking in the United States, certainly today, and it was certainly then. And the attitude, it has encouraged all of the radicals over the world to see America as a wimp. And they're right to see it that way. And they say, oh good, we'll go to negotiate. We'll go to let's plan our next summit to discuss the next summit about the Iranian nukes that are only for peaceful purposes. And meanwhile, they're announcing they've built more centrifuges and they're hiding more, nuclear. You don't have to be a nuclear scientist to understand that what they're saying is, we know that you guys are not going to do anything to us. And we know it because we see it and because you've proven it again and again and again. That's what they see. And that's what we show them. And, I think that it's what is worrisome about it, as I said, I don't think that only the Obama administration is guilty of that. But I do think that there is a difference, again, in attitude about your country. One thing Bush did do and Reagan did do, say, we are good guys, we are a good country, Israel is a good country, those people are bad guys, it's not that complicated. But for some reason, it is.
But nonetheless, when push comes to shove, Bush didn't do anything. And I wonder in the Iranian context if a Romney presidency next year would behave radically differently from a second
No,
Obama
it wouldn't
presidency.
behave radically differently except in one thing. It wouldn't behave radically differently in all, except it wouldn't down Israeli planes if they went to do it instead.
Which you
No, I'm exaggerating, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. Oh, yes. Yes, you can. Yeah, can we?
Well,
Yes,
hang
of
on a
course.
second, because I'm going to ask a couple more
Yes.
questions and then
Oh,
we'll turn this
Sure,
this
then
over
we'll
to
turn it to Caroline first.
I want to ask you about some of the points that we've made in the context of Iran, of Egypt, which also figures in your book, and the Israeli take on the Arab Spring, I think, was always much more wary than the
Yes.
American take,
Yes.
and somewhat more informed after the event, I would
Yes.
say. Before the event, I don't think Israel, with our fantastic intelligence gathering capacity, didn't predict it. Didn't even predict it spreading to Egypt after it happened in Tunisia and so on.
Right.
Tremendously worrying, but was very wary from the start because it recognized very early on that the only organized opposition in these countries was the Muslim Brotherhood, and that was what was likely to happen. And in the same way that the ousting of the Shah and the hope of democracy was subverted by a version of Islamist leadership, that would be the same thing that unfolded. And yet there's an argument, and I interviewed Natan Sharansky quite soon after, certainly at some stage of the Egyptian revolution, I think after Mubarak had fallen, and he said you can't stop these forces where people want to be free. People have to, where they get the opportunity to be liberated from dictators under whom they cannot speak their minds, they will seize that opportunity. And he also, and I don't want to mischaracterize Nathan, because it was a very subtle and complicated and protracted argument that he made, and I'm going to be distorting it simply by summarizing it. But his point was, ultimately, if you have the beginnings of something that leads towards democracy, whatever the government is, they're going to have to be confronting their own problems. Those are the only people that you've got there. Mubarak fostered the viciously anti-Israel and anti-Semitic mindset there, and therefore this may not ultimately all be terrible, and in any case, people have to be free. What do you say to that?
Okay, first of all, you know, I have great respect for Nathan Sharansky. And I was a little disappointed in his response to the Arab Spring because it was Nathan Sharansky who taught me that the definition of democracy is not the ballot box, but the ballot box comes at the end after there's democracy. And I felt a little bit surprised that he then came out saying this. But I will say that I know other people like Nathan who what they say is, and if you have to pay attention to it because what they say, you cannot stop these forces. And then they compare it to the French Revolution. And they say, yes, there'll be a lot of bloodshed, and in 100 years there's going to be democracy in Egypt. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't have 100 years to sit around and wait for that and say, you know what, we can't stop the forces, so let me sit back and let them bomb the hell out of me or whatever else. No, maybe that's true. It may be, and it may not be. But that is not what I call the forces of freedom. In Egypt, the forces of freedom were not the ones spurring that Facebook revolution. That's the first mistake. They were not. There were a few of them. There's a small number of them. But many of those, as I also described the rape of Lara Logan in this book, they were the jeans and sneakers Facebook revolutionaries. Just because someone's on Facebook doesn't make him a liberal Democrat. It also means that they're saying, you know what, we've been abused by the Mubarak regime so long. Now we want to be the abusers.
Well, I think there were a lot of people in Egypt who didn't vote for the Muslim Brotherhood, right? The elections.
No, they vote for the Salafists.
Well, no, which I think was the second candidate and got almost half of the vote. I think it's more complicated than that. Anyway,
okay.
We'll go to the audience, and I want
So now
because Nathan was not here to defend himself, he didn't say anything to me about the French Revolution and 100
No,
years.
he didn't, but I heard. That's true, so we have to say that.
Okay, Caroline, you want to go? Ashley, how do you want to do this? Just people will stand up, or is there a microphone?
In fact, Nathan, can we go live?
So I just wanted to ask a question.
No, just 1 second, Carolyn. In fact, Nathan Shemansky was here earlier in the evening. He may still be floating around somewhere. But I do want to say hello to Caroline. Because she's been on the program almost 7 years. How's the new baby?
Thank you. Well, if you want me in the audience, just bring Ruthi here.
Okay.
Otherwise, she's on the stage.
Give us your question.
So, relating actually to the whole issue of democracy and to the issue of the Muslim world, one of the things that I've always found interesting about Americans and Israelis is that because we're free, we have a lot of time to think about our lives and how we want to live them. And therefore, we're not that involved in the people around us. Did you find when you were interviewing these people that they developed perhaps after the fact a curiosity about Iran, or did you find that, and about the developments inside of the Islamic world after this had happened to the United States, or did you find that once the crisis was over and the hostages were freed, that they went back to not caring? And if so, how do you, obviously my view is that yes, they stopped caring, and therefore we're seeing a repetition of this with Obama. So first of all, do you agree? And second of all, what do you think that we can do to try to get people to be more curious, even when they're free and have all of the time in the world to think about their own life and how much they hate their own cynical politicians and don't think about the societies that surround us in this world?
Wow, that's a tough one. The first question is easier than the second one to answer.
And by the way, great book.
Before you answer, you'll be able to buy the book tonight at a discount at that table over there. It's worth reading and will fill in a lot of the missing pieces that are not being covered tonight.
Right, okay. Carolyn, what you asked me, if people sort of go back to their lives, what is interesting is that I think that's true, but I think it's even worse than that. It's more than that they go back to their lives and forget, but somehow it doesn't make a dent, even that kind of major event. Didn't seem to make a dent in people who already believed in negotiation above all. So it wasn't merely that they sort of forgot, but rather they adhered to those policies and politics afterwards. But one of the hostages, named Barry Rosen, who was he was always a Democrat, and always he probably still is, and certainly no right-winger or anything like that. He was extremely traumatized by all of this. He actually was a Farsi speaker, by the way, a Jew and a Farsi speaker. And Barry Rosen went through a horrible trauma after this happened for years. But one of the things he's been doing since then is fighting one of the clauses that Jimmy Carter had to agree to as part of the deal to release the hostages. And one of those, and the clause had to do with that no American can sue the Iranian government anymore after that event. Had to agree to that. So the hostages feel like, okay, listen, that's not a real agreement. I mean, you have even in legal terms, if someone puts a gun to your head and you sign an agreement, that doesn't constitute a legal agreement. This definitely was the gun to the head kind of agreement, let them out of it. And there are a group of those hostages who are still fighting that specific issue rather than the general. He hasn't changed his general view. All he wants is for the hostage takers to give him an apology. He says they never apologized. Okay, so that's one thing. The other is that some people change their minds after things happen. I can use Israel as an example. We saw that there are people, not mentioning any names, David Horowitz, whose politics shifted after, let's say, the Second Intifada, the First Intifada. People, I don't mean the whole worldview, but let's put it this way, as my father likes to say, they switched the ground under me. Okay, I was a liberal, but now being a liberal means that, and so now I'm called a right-winger. Okay, something like that. The point being that the same thing happened in America. How do you get people to pay attention to things? You know what, I honestly don't know the answer to that question, Carolyn. I think you would do a better job of it than I would to understand that, because I think that the willful blindness about the fact that any Israeli who serves in the military and lives in our neighborhood, that any Israeli today doesn't see the dangers, immediate dangers, or somehow blames Israel for it, if that happens here, how in the world can Americans see it differently? Yeah. I don't know. Oh, Bobby.
We have one more question. Please come up here so everybody hears the question.
First of all, thank you very much for a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Bobby.
But when you talk about wrapping your head around something, one thing just never ceases to amaze me. And that's how the left, and to a large extent the radical left, which has always stood for certain principles, has embraced Muslim theology, Muslim politics, and Muslim actions, even though they are the antithesis not only of left-wing beliefs, but of societal beliefs. And yet there was complete silence. An Israeli soldier hitting a protester with a gun stock, immediately it's around the world. But shooting 200 people, including 60 kids in the head, well, that's okay. Yeah. And I just can't understand how in anyone's mind that can continue to be the norm in the world.
Well, Andy McCarthy wrote this great book I recommend it to everybody called The Grand Jihad, how the left and radical Islam, I can't remember the exact underline, if anyone can, why they that's willful blindness, but the Grand Jihad also has it. They're both, the Grand Jihad has that too. The collusion between the left and the radical Islam that doesn't make sense, and he explains how it does make sense.
We have another question here.
I have a question. It seems to me that there's always a bottom line, and the bottom line is whom does it profit? When you say they disbanded the CIA, who disbanded and for what reasons? And when you think of it, Carter went on to be a consultant to Gaddafi, and it seems there was definitely a payoff. I mean, nobody can be that stupid. And I think that the business of America is business, and Saudi Arabia had an enormous influence on how the CIA and certain institutions, the State Department especially, saw Islam and how they facilitated the Islamic victories in Bosnia and so on. And so who pays?
Well, the question here has to do with money, and I'm really bad at that stuff. I know, Yael, I understand what you're saying, and that there might be, to follow the money trail, to understand. But I personally, everyone has his own pet peeve. Mine is ideology. I actually think that people have ideology. It's not just, who's funding them. There is a lot of that, maybe. Yes. There's a bit of that. I know the Carter Center, there was a question about funding there, and Alan Dershowitz made a whole big stink about that, but I haven't followed the money trail, just the ideology trail.
One more question here. We'll try and take care of everybody.
Right.
Speaking to the mic.
Thank you, Ruthi. I'm a bit puzzled by your ideology, because you seem to suggest that if you are not embracing an interventionist type of politics, and you are choosing dialogue and you're choosing negotiation, it's as if you are colluding with the ideology of the opposition. And I've got a problem with that, because I think that you can engage in dialogue, you can engage in negotiation without necessarily saying that I actually believe in your ideology, or I believe your ideology is right. So why is it that you're equating negotiation with, oh, we are weak, we are not really proud of what we are standing for, we're not proud for the values that we represent, and it means that we are actually colluding with the enemy, over the ideology of the enemy?
Okay, that's a good question. And I think the answer is that there's nothing wrong with negotiating. If two parties have the aim to settle a dispute, all right? That could be a husband and wife, it could be neighbors, it could be anybody. There is a dispute, and two people have an argument, and they then want to come to an arrangement. When you have a radical force, could be a government, could be a terrorist group, who has no interest in reaching an end goal with you, you're not negotiating. What he is saying is, I want to destroy you, nothing you do will be good enough, you are bad and we are going to wipe you out. There is no room for negotiation. And what you said, I'm for interventionist. I would say it the other way around. I think we're too interventionist with handing out the cash to people who don't deserve it. All right, we meaning the West, by the way. When I say we, I mean Israel, the United States, and the European Union. It's one thing not to dictate to another country what it does internally. It is quite another to reward it for doing things that are antithetical to our values.
Jeff Down, Executive Director of the Zionist Organization of America, and a good friend.
Hi, Ruthi.
No speeches, just
No
a question.
speeches. Quick question. By the way, I'm going to move your book up to #1 on the must-read triage list. I just wanted to ask you, there are many policy wonks and pundits out there that believe that Jimmy Carter is much, much more consequential as a post-president than he was during a failed presidency. Do you discuss that at all in your book, of what impact he's having now, either through his books, let's say like Peace Not Apartheid? And number two, do you foresee that maybe in 2030, 2040, we will be dealing with the same thing from former President Obama after a failed presidency?
I don't go into detail about Jimmy Carter's post-presidency. It's mentioned, of course. But what I do say and what I mean is that what is consequential about his post-presidency is not that it's particularly consequential. I mean, it's all right. There are post-presidents. You know, presidents have a life after their presidency. But that his legacy has really taken hold in the Democratic Party. That was the Democratic Party, let's say, of Scoop Jackson. And then it moved over to become the Democratic Party of radicals like Jimmy Carter. And his legacy lives on. It doesn't really matter. Look, Jimmy Carter may even do good things. He goes and builds houses in the third world and whatever, and that's, whatever he does is fine. But the fact that he's even speaking at the convention, you know, the point is that his legacy is alive and well in the party. That's one thing. And the other is that I mean, in other words, when you have a former president whose view of America is dim, and that affects the party from which he hails, yes, it has an effect.
We have a policy here of always sticking to our schedule. When we start, when we finish.
Okay.
Ruthi will be here for a while. You'll be able to talk to her, ask her your
And
questions.
there's more food.
You can buy the book. You're invited to partake of refreshments. We appreciate your coming. We look forward to having you here at the next meeting. David and Ruthi, you were great. And there'll be a meeting tomorrow at the starting soon. Thank you very much.
How you keeping? Nice to see you.
I'm sorry. David, we're friends on Facebook.
I mean, I see your point, but they weren't in the frame of Casas Bill. They didn't even want it.
But it would have given us an excuse.
It would have, but we didn't want one.
Right.
See, had we won it, we had one anyway. I didn't want an excuse.
Okay, thank you.
But I really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. I'm about to go to New York. That's why I'm maybe too late. I may have made them all. We can compare mistakes. I've learned from my mistakes. Exactly. So, okay. I love it. Oh, I told you that. Didn't I say that? You did. I'm really touched.